In the chill of spring 1642, a group of French settlers disembarked on the banks of a vast river known to the indigenous people as Hochelaga. Their mission was not conquest, not trade, but faith. They dreamed of building a spiritual utopia, a new Jerusalem, in the heart of North America. This small band, led by Paul de Chaumadé de Maisonneuve and Jean Mons, could not have known that their fragile settlement would one day grow into one of the most vibrant cultural centers in the world, Montreal. But at that time, their odds of survival were slim. The dense wilderness of New France was unforgiving. The Iroquois Confederacy dominated the land, and the harsh winters tested every soul who dared to remain. Yet, from this mix of danger, hope, and devotion, Montreal began its long journey through centuries of conflict and transformation. Montreal is more than a city. It's a living record of human endurance, cultural collision, and reinvention. It's where Europe met North America not through violence alone, but through adaptation, alliance, and exchange. And it all started with a single decision: to plant a mission in a place no one thought could survive. The land they chose wasn't random. Long before the French arrived, this island was sacred ground. Indigenous peoples, the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, the Algonquin, and the Huron, had used it for centuries as a place of gathering and trade. The name Montreal, from which Montreal would eventually come, was given by explorer Jacques Cartier in 1535. He had stood upon the mountain that still defines the city today and named it in honor of the French king. But after Cartier's brief visit, the settlement of Hochelaga vanished from history, likely due to warfare or disease. When Samuel de Champlain arrived decades later, the people Cartier met were gone. Only silence remained. That silence would soon be broken. In the early 1600s, the French crown saw the potential of New France not just as a land of resources, but as a realm of faith. Missionary zeal and mercantile ambition joined hands. The Société Notre-Dame de Montréal was formed, an association of devout Catholics determined to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and establish a permanent Christian community. Paul de Chaumadé de Maisonneuve, a soldier from Champagne, was chosen to lead. Jean Mons, a nurse devoted to both God and humanity, joined him. Together, they crossed the Atlantic, guided more by conviction than certainty. When they arrived in May 1642, they found an island wild and alive, dense forests, swift rivers, and a constant sense of peril. They named their settlement Ville Marie, the City of Mary. But their dream of peace was soon tested. The Iroquois Confederacy, powerful and unyielding, viewed the French expansion with suspicion. Attacks were frequent, brutal, and devastating. Yet, against all odds, Ville Marie held on. Montreal nearly didn't survive at all. For years, it was on the brink of extinction. The settlement's population was tiny, food was scarce, and war was constant. But Jean Mons's hospital, Hôtel Dieu de Montréal, became a beacon. It tended to the sick and wounded, both French and indigenous, and helped hold the fragile colony together. Maisonneuve himself led the defense of the town, refusing to abandon it even when ordered by higher authorities. In one of the most defining moments, he made a vow. If the city survived, he would erect a cross atop the mountain in gratitude. He kept his word. To this day, a cross stands on Mount Royal, a quiet monument to a promise made nearly 4 centuries ago.
But Montreal's story wasn't just one of survival, it was of transformation. The French colonists learned to adapt. They traded, learned indigenous routes, and built alliances through necessity. Over time, the settlement began to thrive as a fur trading post, perfectly positioned along the St. Lawrence River, the artery of the French Empire in North America. By the late 17th century, Montreal had become a crucial outpost in the global fur trade network. Beaver pelts from the vast wilderness flowed through its markets, linking the Great Lakes to Parisian fashion houses. The coureurs de bois, daring French-Canadian traders, pushed deeper into the interior, carrying with them the name and influence of Montreal. The city became both gateway and frontier, pulsing with ambition and danger. But behind this prosperity was constant conflict. The French presence disrupted indigenous alliances and economies, pulling nations into European rivalries. The Iroquois Wars continued, fueled by the broader struggle between France and England for control of North America. Montreal became both a fortress and a target. In 1701, something remarkable happened, a moment that changed the course of the city forever. Representatives from nearly 40 indigenous nations gathered in Montreal for what became known as the Great Peace. After decades of bloodshed, the French and the Iroquois Confederacy agreed to terms that would end the cycle of war. The Great Peace of Montreal, signed that year, was one of the largest and most inclusive diplomatic agreements in early North American history. This peace brought stability, but it also revealed Montreal's growing importance. It was no longer a fragile outpost. It was the beating heart of New France's western expansion. Its streets began to fill with traders, missionaries, and settlers. Its church spires rose above wooden houses. It had become more than a mission. It was now a city. But just as Montreal began to rise, a storm gathered across the Atlantic. The Old World's empires were about to clash, and the outcome would change Montreal forever. By the mid-18th century, Montreal had grown into the western stronghold of New France, a city of stone walls, narrow streets, and the scent of fir and wood smoke. Merchants filled its bustling markets with goods from across the empire: beaver pelts, muskets, iron tools, and fine fabrics. Jesuit priests taught Latin and scripture, while soldiers stood guard against threats from every horizon. Yet beneath the daily rhythm, tension was building. Across the Atlantic, Europe's old powers were once again preparing for war. And this time, the battle would decide the fate of North America. The rivalry between France and Britain was no longer confined to Europe. It stretched across oceans and continents. In the 1750s, their conflict exploded into the 7 Years' War, a global struggle for dominance that reached deep into the forests of Quebec. Montreal, once a peaceful hub of trade, became a military outpost once again. While Quebec City became the main target of British invasion, Montreal's fall would mark the end of an entire empire's dream. The French Empire in North America had been built on fur, faith, and fragile alliances, but the British came with numbers, naval strength, and determination. In 1759, the French fortress at Quebec fell after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, a short but decisive clash that took the life of France's General Montcalm and Britain's General Wolfe. The defeat sent shockwaves through New France. Montreal stood as the last major French city in the colony, isolated, surrounded, and leaderless. By September 1760, British forces advanced from 3 directions: from Quebec, Lake Ontario, and Lake Champlain. The French governor, Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, saw no way out. On September 8th, he surrendered Montreal to the British under General Geoffrey Amherst. No shots were fired. It was the quiet end of French rule in Canada. That day, the fleur-de-lis was lowered from the ramparts and the Union Jack rose in its place. The colony of New France was gone. In its ashes stood a new dominion, one that would be ruled not by Paris, but by London.
But here's what few people realize. The British conquest did not erase Montreal's French spirit. Instead, it reshaped it. The city became a paradox, a French heart beating under a British crown. After the conquest, many French elites fled back to France, but the majority of settlers stayed. They became subjects of the British king, speaking French, practicing Catholicism, and living under new rulers who spoke an unfamiliar tongue. At first, it seemed impossible that such different peoples could coexist. Yet necessity forged an uneasy peace. The British needed the French to maintain the fur trade and to keep the colony stable. The French needed the British for protection and governance.
In 1763, the Treaty of Paris formalized Britain's victory. France ceded all of its territories east of the Mississippi River, including Canada. For Montreal, it was the beginning of an identity crisis, but also of reinvention. The British saw Montreal's strategic potential immediately. Its location on the St. Lawrence River made it the perfect link between the Atlantic world and the interior of the continent. Merchants from Scotland and England poured in, bringing capital, connections, and ambition. Within decades, Montreal began to change. Its wooden buildings gave way to brick warehouses, its French traders found themselves competing with British firms, and its skyline began to mirror the confidence of a growing empire. But beneath the surface, the two worlds were merging in unexpected ways. Many of the new British merchants married into French families, blending their fortunes and cultures. Business alliances replaced military rivalries. Montreal became a city of dual identities, where French was spoken in homes and English in boardrooms, where Catholic churches stood beside Anglican chapels. This balance wasn't easy. Religion, language, and politics often collided. The French Catholic clergy sought to protect their traditions, while British authorities wanted to impose their laws and customs. The tension reached a boiling point in the early 1770s as unrest spread through the British colonies to the south. When the American Revolution erupted in 1775, its flames reached northward. American forces invaded Canada, hoping the French population might join them against Britain. They captured Montreal briefly, but the support they hoped for never came. French Canadians, weary of war and uncertain of their future, stayed loyal to peace rather than rebellion. By 1776, the Americans withdrew, leaving Montreal firmly under British control. But the revolution changed the city in another way. Thousands of loyalists, Americans who remained faithful to the British crown, fled north. Many settled in Quebec and Ontario, bringing with them English customs, businesses, and political ideas. Montreal, already a city of two worlds, became even more diverse. By the turn of the 19th century, Montreal was transforming once again, this time from a colonial outpost into an emerging metropolis. Its population surged, its economy expanded beyond the fur trade into shipping, banking, and manufacturing. The Hudson's Bay Company and the Northwest Company, two giants of the fur trade, battled for dominance, with Montreal merchants at the center of their rivalry. Their competition reached every corner of North America, from the Arctic to the Pacific. This fur empire would soon collapse under its own success. As European fashion shifted and industrialization changed trade patterns, the fur trade declined. Montreal needed a new purpose. And just as it had done before, the city adapted. In 1825, the opening of the Lachine Canal changed everything. It allowed ships to bypass the dangerous rapids west of the city, connecting Montreal directly to the Great Lakes. For the first time, the city became a true port, a gateway to the interior. Factories sprang up along the canal, harnessing its water power. Immigrants from Ireland and Scotland arrived in waves, drawn by the promise of work. The city's population doubled, then tripled. Smokestacks replaced steeples as symbols of progress. But progress came at a cost. The working-class neighborhoods along the canal were harsh and crowded. Disease spread quickly, and labor was brutal. The Irish immigrants, in particular, suffered terribly during the Great Famine of the 1840s, when thousands arrived sick and starving. Many died in quarantine on the outskirts of Montreal. The Black Rock Memorial, still standing today, marks their graves, a haunting reminder of the price of growth. Yet through it all, Montreal's multicultural identity deepened. French, English, Irish, Scottish, and Indigenous influences all shaped its voice, its music, and its streets. The city had learned something vital, that survival depended on blending, not breaking. By mid-century, Montreal had become the largest city in British North America, the industrial and financial heart of what would soon become Canada.
It built railways that stitched the continent together and banks that financed its future. But its political loyalties remained divided. French Canadians, now minority in their own metropolis, fought to preserve their language and faith. British Montrealers, meanwhile, pushed for modernization and imperial unity. And then, in 1867, everything changed again. The Confederation of Canada united the colonies into a single dominion under British rule. Montreal, with its wealth and industry, became the economic engine of this new nation. But not everyone felt included in this dream. French Canadians feared losing their voice in a country dominated by English-speaking power. Once again, Montreal stood at a crossroads, torn between two identities, two futures. But perhaps that's what made it so unique. Montreal was not just surviving empires anymore, it was shaping them. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Montreal that had begun as a remote mission of faith and survival had become something entirely different. A roaring engine of industry, culture, and ambition. Steamships filled its harbor. Smoke rose from the factories lining the Lachine Canal. The city hummed with the sound of progress. But beneath the excitement was tension, between classes, between languages, and between visions of what Montreal should become. The British merchants saw a global trading hub. The French Canadians saw a homeland under pressure. And immigrants from Ireland, Italy, and Eastern Europe saw opportunity, hardship, and hope intertwined. Montreal was now the beating heart of Canada's economy. Its factories produced textiles, locomotives, sugar, and steel. Its banks, including the Bank of Montreal and the Royal Bank of Canada, financed projects across the country. Its railways connected the Atlantic to the prairies, and its port became one of the busiest in North America. By the early 1900s, it wasn't just a city, it was Canada's gateway to the world. This rise wasn't gentle. It was built on hard labor and human struggle. The industrial boom drew thousands of workers from rural Quebec and beyond. Entire families lived in cramped tenements near the canal, working long hours in poor conditions. Child labor was common. Disease, particularly tuberculosis, ravaged working-class neighborhoods. The city's elite, the so-called square mile of wealthy Anglophone families, lived in mansions high above downtown, far from the smoke and noise. This divide between rich and poor, French and English, would define the social fabric of Montreal for decades. Still, even amid inequality, something remarkable was happening. Montreal began to see itself as more than an industrial port. It was becoming a center of innovation, education, and art. Institutions such as McGill University expanded their reach. Francophone schools and newspapers flourished. The first electric tramway appeared in 1892, transforming urban life. Streetlights illuminated downtown, and new architectural wonders rose across the skyline: the Notre Dame Basilica, the Windsor Station, and the majestic Sun Life Building. The city was modernizing fast, but its cultural divide deepened. English dominated commerce and politics. French Canadians, though the majority by number, held little economic power. This imbalance planted seeds of resentment, seeds that would grow over the coming century into a movement for equality and identity. Meanwhile, Montreal's role on the world stage grew. During World War I, the city became a hub of manufacturing for the Allied war effort. Factories shifted to produce munitions and military supplies. Thousands enlisted. Yet the war also exposed deep fractures. The conscription crisis of 1917, when the federal government forced military service, divided the nation. French Canadians, led by nationalist Henri Bourassa, resisted fiercely. They saw it as a war for Britain, not for Canada. Protests erupted in Montreal, reflecting the city's growing struggle between nationalism and imperial loyalty. After the war, the 1920s brought new energy. Jazz clubs, cinemas, and speakeasies filled the streets. Montreal became known as the Paris of North America, a city that never slept.
Prohibition in the United States turned it into a playground for Americans seeking freedom and liquor. The nightlife exploded. Cabarets, dance halls, and restaurants thrived. Underneath the glamour, crime syndicates and political corruption flourished. Montreal's underworld became infamous, weaving itself into the city's legend. But this era of celebration didn't last. When the Great Depression struck in 1929, Montreal's prosperity collapsed almost overnight. Factories closed, unemployment soared. Thousands lined up for bread and coal. Entire neighborhoods fell into poverty. For many, survival meant improvisation, selling apples on the streets, sharing single rooms, or relying on church charity.
Yet, even in crisis, Montreal's spirit refused to break. Civic leaders began massive public works projects to revive the city. The construction of the Jacques Cartier Bridge in 1930 and the Mount Royal Tunnel symbolized a belief that the city could build its way out of despair. And in a sense, it did. When World War II began in 1939, Montreal once again became a vital manufacturing center. Its factories turned out aircraft, weapons, and uniforms. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Immigrants arrived in waves, rebuilding lives after fleeing Europe's destruction. The city grew into a symbol of resilience, a place that could adapt to any challenge. But after the war, Montreal faced a new kind of transformation, one not of war or industry, but of culture. The old social order was beginning to crumble. The dominance of the Anglophone elite was fading. A new generation of French Canadians, educated and ambitious, demanded change. This was the beginning of Montreal's second great reinvention. The 1950s and 60s brought rapid modernization. Highways carved through old neighborhoods, skyscrapers climbed higher. The St. Lawrence Seaway, opened in 1959, connected Montreal directly to the Atlantic Ocean, making it a true global port. But as the city rose, so did political tension. Quebec's French-speaking majority began questioning their place in a country they felt didn't fully represent them. The spark came with the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s, a social and political awakening that changed Quebec forever. Montreal became its epicenter. For the first time in history, French Canadians began to take control of their own institutions, government, and economy. Education secularized, the church's influence declined, and a new pride in French identity emerged. But this awakening wasn't peaceful. Radical groups, such as the Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ, began to use violence to demand independence. Bombings, kidnappings, and protests shook the city. The October Crisis of 1970, when British diplomat James Cross was kidnapped and Quebec's Minister of Labour Pierre Laporte was murdered, plunged Montreal into chaos. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau invoked the War Measures Act, deploying troops in the streets. It was one of the darkest and most controversial moments in Canadian history. Yet, once again, Montreal endured. Out of the fear and anger came dialogue, reform, and a renewed sense of purpose. The city was learning to channel its turmoil into creativity. In 1967, just before the crisis, Montreal had hosted one of the most iconic world events of the 20th century, Expo 67. For 6 months, the world turned its eyes toward Montreal. Nations from around the globe built futuristic pavilions on the islands of the St. Lawrence River. Over 50 million people attended. It was a celebration of progress, culture, and unity. For many, it was the moment Montreal became not just Canada's greatest city, but a world city. The skyline transformed. The Habitat 67 complex redefined architecture. The Montreal Metro opened, sleek and efficient. Bridges, highways, and parks gave the city a modern pulse, as if Montreal had been reborn. By the early 1970s, Montreal stood as a city caught between pride and uncertainty. It had just dazzled the world with Expo 67, a moment that promised endless possibility. But beneath the glow, political and cultural rifts were widening. Quebec's quiet revolution had reshaped society, and French-speaking Quebecers were reclaiming their voice. Yet that same awakening began to unsettle the delicate balance that had defined Montreal for generations. For centuries, the city's identity had rested on coexistence, English and French, old and new, faith and modernity. Now that balance was tipping. Montreal was becoming the epicenter of a movement that sought not just recognition, but transformation. In 1976, Quebec elected the Parti Québécois under Premier René Lévesque, a moment that would redefine the province's politics and Montreal's destiny. For the first time, Quebec had a government openly committed to the idea of independence. The PQ promised to protect the French language, culture, and economic rights of Quebecers who'd long felt marginalized in their own land. But there was a cost. As the Charter of the French Language, Bill 101, was introduced in 1977, French became the official language of government, education, and business. The law transformed Montreal overnight. Shop signs had to be in French. Immigrants were required to send their children to French-language schools. While many saw this as a long overdue step toward equality, others, particularly English-speaking Montrealers and business leaders, saw it as exclusion. The impact was immediate. Banks, insurance companies, and corporate headquarters began to move west to Toronto, fearing instability and the growing independence movement. Montreal, once the undisputed financial capital of Canada, started to lose its economic crown. For the first time in over a century, Toronto surpassed it as the country's dominant economic center. The very laws meant to protect Montreal's identity nearly stripped it of its global status. The 1970s and 80s became years of exodus. Over 100,000 English-speaking residents left the city. Major corporations such as the Bank of Montreal and Sun Life Insurance relocated their headquarters. Office towers downtown stood half empty. And yet, something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. As power shifted away from Montreal's English elite, the city began to redefine itself on new terms, proudly, unapologetically French, but more inclusive than ever. Artists, musicians, and filmmakers began turning Montreal into the cultural capital of Canada. A new generation of Francophone creators emerged, transforming the city into a hub of expression and experimentation. The 1976 Summer Olympics, hosted in Montreal, became a global spectacle. The city built the Olympic Stadium, a futuristic masterpiece of architecture, though plagued by construction delays and massive cost overruns. Critics called it the Big O, a symbol of ambition that nearly bankrupted the city. Yet, despite the controversy, the Games put Montreal on the world map once again. Gymnast Nadia Comaneci's Perfect 10 became legend, and the world watched as Montreal celebrated diversity and modernity. But the pride of the Olympics couldn't hide the uncertainty that followed. In 1980, Quebec held its first referendum on independence. The question was simple: should Quebec become a sovereign nation? For Montrealers, it was deeply personal. The city had always thrived on connection between languages, between worlds. Independence would mean breaking that link. When the results came in, 60% voted no. Quebec would stay in Canada, at least for now. Montreal breathed a sigh of relief, but the divisions remained raw. The 1980s brought another wave of change. Montreal's industrial core, once the city's lifeblood, began to decline. Globalization, automation, and competition from abroad shut down factories that had operated for generations. The Lachine Canal, once the heart of industry, fell silent.
Entire neighborhoods like Griffintown and Saint-Henri slipped into decay. The city's unemployment rate soared. But out of the economic hardship came creativity. Abandoned factories became studios, galleries, and rehearsal spaces. Artists reclaimed the spaces industry had left behind. By the late 1980s, a new Montreal was emerging, grittier, bolder, more artistic. Then came another shock. In 1995, Quebec held a second referendum on independence. This time, the vote was heartbreakingly close. The yes side, favoring sovereignty, won 49.4% of the vote. The no side just 50.6%. The result tore through Montreal's soul. Families, friends, and neighbors found themselves on opposite sides of the debate. The night of the vote, tens of thousands gathered downtown in silence. Relief, sorrow, and exhaustion mingling in the cold air. But something shifted after that near separation. The people of Montreal began to turn their energy inward, away from politics, toward renewal. The focus moved from what Montreal should be to what it already was, a cultural powerhouse. During the 1990s, Montreal's creative explosion became undeniable. Cirque du Soleil, founded in the 1980s by street performers Guy Liliberté and Gilles Decroix, captured the world's imagination, redefining what circus art could be. Musicians, filmmakers, and designers from Montreal began making waves internationally. The city's bilingual culture became its strength rather than its weakness. It could speak to the world in two languages, and both with soul. Montreal's crises had not destroyed it. They had purified it. Each collapse forced reinvention. Each loss made room for something new.